The point, she continued, is that your primary mission as a naval aviator isn't to shoot down enemy aircraft or deliver ordnance on target or demonstrate American military superiority. Your primary mission is to use your training, your aircraft, and your judgment to protect people and serve the larger interests of national security. Sometimes that means fighting. Sometimes it means talking. Sometimes it means knowing when to walk away. Lieutenant Chen raised his hand again. Ma'am, what if talking doesn't work? Ghost smiled, remembering her younger self asking similar questions. Then you make sure you've exhausted every other option before you resort to violence. Because once you cross that line, once you make the decision to engage with lethal force, you can't take it back. You have to live with the consequences for the rest of your life. After the session, she walked out to the flight line where her assigned aircraft waited. It was an FA-18E Super Hornet, Bureau number 168,492, the same type of aircraft she'd been flying 6 months ago when everything went wrong over the South China Sea. The ground crew chief, a weathered petty officer named Rodriguez, snapped to attention as she approached. Ma'am, your bird is ready for flight. All systems check normal, fuel load per your specifications, no maintenance discrepancies. Ghost ran her hand along the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the slight vibration that came from the auxiliary power unit running to keep the systems active. The familiar weight of her helmet bag over her shoulder, the smell of jet exhaust mixing with ocean air, the distant sound of other aircraft taxiing for takeoff, all of it combined to create a sensory experience that was as much homecoming as professional duty. Chief Rodriguez, she said, how long have you been working on Hornets? 16 years, ma'am, since I was a young airman straight out of technical school. Then you've probably seen a lot of pilots come and go. Some who thought they were invincible, some who were afraid of their own shadows, some who figured out how to do the job without losing themselves in the process. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, I've seen all kinds. What's your assessment of pilots who come back from medical leave? The chief petty officer considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer carried weight beyond casual conversation. Ma'am, in my experience, pilots who have been through something difficult and come back, they tend to be more careful. Not scared careful, but thoughtful careful. They understand that the aircraft and the mission and the people counting on them are all more important than whatever ego trip got them into trouble in the first place. Ghost nodded, appreciating his honesty. Chief, I want you to know that I plan to take very good care of your aircraft. And if you ever see me making decisions that put the bird or the mission at risk because I'm trying to prove something to myself, I want you to speak up. Yes, ma'am, always. She climbed into the cockpit, running through the familiar ritual of strapping in, connecting communications and life support systems, reviewing the mission profile one final time. It was a simple training flight, air-to-air combat maneuvering with a partner aircraft, basic formation work, some instrument approaches back at Lemoore. Nothing challenging, nothing that would push her limits or test her recovery from whatever had happened over the South China Sea. But as she started the engines and felt the familiar vibration of 40,000 pounds of thrust potential at the Boeing 787 shuddered through another pocket of rough air over the Pacific. But Lieutenant Commander Kira Ghost Volkov didn't even open her eyes. 3 rows behind her, a businessman gripped his armrest white-knuckled. 2 seats up, a mother whispered reassurances to her crying infant. But Ghost had learned to sleep through far worse than commercial turbulence. She'd caught catnaps while pulling 7GS in an FA-18 Super Hornet, dozed between combat missions over the South China Sea, and once famously slept standing up during a briefing that lasted 14 hours. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom with practiced calm, but there was something different in her tone, a tremor that made Ghost's eyes snap open. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has asked me to inquire if there are any current or former military pilots aboard this aircraft. If so, please press your call button immediately. Ghost's hand moved instinctively toward the button, then hesitated. She was traveling in civilian clothes, her Navy service ribbons packed away in checked luggage, her short auburn hair grown out just enough to blend in with the other passengers heading to Tokyo. 3 months of medical leave had been supposed to help her forget the sound of surface-to-air missiles screaming past her canopy, the weight of decisions made in split seconds that determined who lived and who didn't. She'd been sleeping dreamlessly for the first time in 2 years. The turbulence hit again, harder this time, and through her window she could see something that made her stomach drop, not the usual scattered clouds of Pacific weather, but the distinctive contrails of military aircraft. 4 of them, flying in tight formation about 2 miles off their starboard wing. The businessman behind her was now openly praying in what sounded like Japanese. Ghost pressed her call button. Within 30 seconds, a flight attendant appeared, not the same young woman who'd made the announcement, but a graying man whose eyes held the kind of steady calm that only came from experience with actual emergencies. "Ma'am, the captain needs to speak with you immediately." She followed him toward the cockpit, noting how other passengers watched with mixtures of curiosity and growing alarm. A child asked his father why the nice lady was being taken to the front of the plane. Ghost caught fragments of whispered conversations in multiple languages, but the words that reached her most clearly were in English. "Something's wrong. Something's really wrong." The cockpit door opened to reveal Captain Martinez, whose weathered face reminded Ghost of every flight instructor who'd ever tried to wash her out of naval aviation. His co-pilot, a younger man named Peterson according to his nameplate, kept glancing between his instruments and the military formation outside. "You're military?" Martinez asked without preamble. "Navy, Aviator." Ghost's response was automatic, professional. "Active. Medical leave." Martinez nodded grimly. "We've got a problem." Outside the cockpit windows, the 4 aircraft had closed to within a mile, close enough for Ghost to identify them as Chinese J-20 stealth fighters, their angular profiles cutting through the thin air at 38,000 feet. Their presence here, this far from Chinese airspace, violated every international aviation treaty she could think of. More disturbing was their formation, not the loose spread of an escort, but the tight diamond of an intercept package preparing for engagement. "They appeared on our radar 20 minutes ago," Peterson said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Tokyo Control lost contact with us 15 minutes ago. We're being electronically jammed." Ghost studied the tactical display, her mind automatically calculating vectors, fuel states, and engagement envelopes. The J-20s were maintaining position just outside visual range for the passengers, close enough to control the airliner's movements, far enough to avoid panic in the cabin. Professional work. "Any communication attempts?" "Nothing on any frequency," Martinez replied. "Military emergency channels, international distress, even civilian air traffic control. Complete radio silence." He gestured toward the formation. "But they're hurting us. Every time we try to adjust course toward Japan, they adjust to block us. We're being pushed northwest toward North Korea." Ghost finished the sentence, feeling ice form in her stomach. She'd flown reconnaissance missions along the DMZ, knew the radar signatures and missile defense patterns that protected that stretch of airspace. A civilian airliner forced into North Korean territory would create an international incident that could justify anything. The lead J-20 suddenly broke formation, sliding closer to their aircraft. Through the cockpit window, Ghost could see the pilot's helmet turning toward them, his aircraft so close that she could make out individual panel lines on the fuselage. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold. Painted beneath the cockpit was a small silhouette of an FA-18, the kind of kill marking fighter pilots used to commemorate aerial victories. "Captain," she said quietly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Those aren't just any Chinese pilots out there. That lead aircraft is showing kill markings. Naval aviation kill markings." Martinez's face went pale. You mean? I mean whoever's flying that J-20 has shot down American Navy fighters before. Ghost's voice remained steady, but inside, memories were flooding back. Mission briefings about Chinese pilots who defected with advanced aircraft, about engagement rules that had become increasingly blurred as tensions escalated in the South China Sea. And based on their formation and tactics, they're not here to escort us safely anywhere. The radio crackled suddenly with static, then a voice speaking accented but precise English. Commercial aircraft, this is Red Dragon Flight. You are now under our protection. Comply with all heading changes immediately or protective measures will be taken. Ghost felt something shift inside her chest, not fear, but the old familiar weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a well-worn flight suit. She was no longer a passenger hopping to sleep away 3 months of nightmares. She was a naval aviator with 237 carrier landings, 8 combat deployments, and intimate knowledge of how the J-20's radar signature could be exploited by someone who understood its weaknesses. She was, whether she wanted to be or not, the only thing standing between 300 innocent civilians and whatever protective measures Red Dragon Flight had in mind. Captain Martinez, I need you to patch me into your radio system, Ghost said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect from pilots twice her age. And I need Peterson to start calculating fuel consumption rates based on our current heading versus a direct route to Narita. Ma'am, with respect, this is way above. Captain, Ghost's tone cut through his objection like a blade. Those fighters out there, they're not Chinese military. Look at their flight discipline, their formation intervals, their tactical positioning. This is professional work, but it's not People's Liberation Army Air Force professional work. These are pilots who have trained against American tactics, learned our weaknesses, studied our responses. She pointed toward the lead J-20. That kill marking isn't from some border skirmish. It's from someone who's engaged U.S. Navy fighters and won. Martinez studied her face for a long moment, then nodded to Peterson. Give her access to comm. Ghost slipped on the spare headset, feeling the familiar weight of aviation electronics against her skull. For 3 months, she'd avoided anything that reminded her of flying, of the responsibility that came with wings and weapons and the lives of others hanging in the balance. But now, with 300 civilians depending on decisions made in the next few minutes, the old instincts came flooding back. She keyed the microphone. Red Dragon Flight, this is Ghost. I know what you're doing and I know why you're doing it, but you've picked the wrong aircraft and the wrong day. The response came immediately, spoken in English with a slight accent that Ghost couldn't quite place. Ghost who claims knowledge she cannot possess. Ghost who knows that your lead aircraft is flying with a damaged port intake, probably from a bird strike during takeoff. Ghost who knows that your number 3 is running his engines 15 degrees hot, which means he's got maybe 40 minutes of fuel before he has to break off. Ghost who knows that you're not actually Chinese Air Force, because real PLAAF pilots would never risk an international incident this close to Japanese airspace without direct orders from Beijing. Silence on the radio. Then, you speak with confidence for someone trapped at 38,000 feet. I speak with confidence because I've been where you are, Ghost replied. Flying missions that weren't supposed to exist, following orders that couldn't be acknowledged, carrying out operations that would be denied by anyone wearing a uniform. The difference is, I never forgot that my job was to protect people, not threaten them. Another pause. Then the lead J-20 pulled closer, close enough that Ghost could see the pilot's helmet turning toward the cockpit window where she stood. She raised her hand, palm forward, not in surrender, but in the universal aviator's gesture of acknowledgement between professionals. The pilot's helmet tilted slightly, then the J-20 pulled away. Ghost, the voice came back over the radio, you claim to understand our mission. What do you believe we intend? Ghost looked at the tactical display, at the course they were being forced to fly, At the fuel calculations, Peterson was frantically working on his navigation computer. The answer was becoming clear, and it made her sick. "You're going to run us out of fuel over North Korean airspace," she said quietly. "Force us to make an emergency landing, then blame engine failure. 300 American and Japanese civilians held hostage, and you disappear back into whatever hole you crawled out of." The radio went silent for nearly 30 seconds. When the voice returned, there was something different in it, a note of respect that hadn't been there before. "You are more perceptive than expected, Ghost, but perception does not alter reality. Your fuel state, your altitude, your lack of defensive capabilities, these things remain unchanged." Ghost closed her eyes, thinking. In her mind, she could see the tactical situation as clearly as if it were painted on a briefing room wall. 4 highly maneuverable fighters against 1 civilian airliner. No weapons, no countermeasures, no way to fight or run. But Ghost had learned long ago that the most important battles weren't always won with weapons. "Red Dragon lead," she transmitted. "I have a proposition." "We are listening." "You want to complete your mission without creating an international incident. I want to get these civilians home safely. Let me offer you something better than a forced landing in North Korea." Captain Martinez shot her a sharp look, but Ghost held up a hand for silence. "Continue," came the reply. "You're not Chinese military, but you're flying Chinese aircraft. That suggests you're working for someone with access to advanced technology but without official sanction. Private military contractors, maybe, or a nation-state that needs plausible deniability." Ghost's voice remained calm, professional. "Either way, your employer values results over headlines. A civilian airliner going down in international waters would give them exactly what they want, a crisis that could justify whatever larger operation they're planning." She paused, watching the J-20s maintain their formation. They were listening. "But here's what your employer didn't tell you," she continued. "I'm not just any Navy pilot. I'm the pilot who figured out how to track stealth aircraft using civilian radar arrays. I'm the pilot who developed the intercept protocols your people have been trying to steal for 2 years. And I'm the pilot who can make this whole operation worthless with a single radio transmission." This time, the pause stretched longer. Ghost could almost feel the tension crackling across the radio frequencies. "You threaten us." "I'm offering you a way out," Ghost replied. "Turn around, fly home, and report that the target aircraft suffered mechanical difficulties and made an emergency landing in Japan. Your employer gets their crisis, your government gets their deniability, and nobody has to explain why 4 advanced stealth fighters were shot down over international waters by assets that officially don't exist." Martinez stared at her. "What assets?" Ghost smiled for the first time since boarding the aircraft. "Captain, could you please contact Tokyo Control on the emergency frequency and tell them that Hotel Bravo 77 requires immediate assistance?" "Hotel Bravo 77, Peterson looked confused. "That's not our call sign." "No," Ghost said, watching as 4 new contrails appeared on the horizon, approaching fast from the southeast. "It's theirs." The radio erupted with a new voice, speaking in clipped military tones. "Red Dragon Flight, this is Reaper 6-1. You are ordered to immediately alter course and exit this airspace. Any hostile action against the civilian aircraft will be met with appropriate response." Through the cockpit window, Ghost could see the lead J-20 pilot's helmet turning frantically as he spotted the incoming F-22 Raptors, their stealth profiles nearly invisible until they were close enough to engage. "Reaper 6-1, this is Ghost," she transmitted. 4 bogies in close formation, J-20s with non-standard markings. They've been electronically jamming civilian traffic and forcing course deviations toward hostile airspace." "Copy, Ghost. We have them on scope. Red Dragon Flight, You have 30 seconds to alter course to heading 090 and exit Japanese Air Defense Identification Zone. This is your only warning. Ghost watched the tactical display as the situation transformed in real time. The J-20s, which had seemed so threatening moments before, were now caught between the approaching Raptors and the civilian airliner they'd been using as both shield and target. Their superior numbers meant nothing when they couldn't engage without risking the lives of hundreds of innocent people. The lead Chinese pilot's voice came back over the radio, and for the first time, Ghost heard something she recognized. The sound of a professional aviator making the hardest decision in aerial combat, knowing when to withdraw. "Ghost," he transmitted, "you play a dangerous game." "I play the only game that matters," she replied, "getting people home alive. Perhaps we will meet again, under different circumstances." "Maybe we will," Ghost said quietly. "But next time, remember that some of us still believe in protecting people instead of using them." The J-20s broke formation simultaneously, rolling away from the airliner in a coordinated withdrawal that spoke of countless hours of training together. Within minutes, they had disappeared beyond radar range, leaving only the reassuring presence of the F-22s maintaining a protective escort. Captain Martinez let out a breath he'd been holding for the last 10 minutes. "Ma'am, how did you?" "Hotel Bravo 77 is a recognition code," Ghost explained, settling back in the jump seat behind the cockpit. "It tells friendly forces that there's a naval aviator aboard a civilian aircraft who requires immediate assistance. I transmitted my identity when I first spoke to Red Dragon Flight. Anyone monitoring military frequencies would have heard it." "But how did you know the Raptors were out there?" Ghost looked out at the F-22s flying protective formation off their wings, their pilots undoubtedly wondering who the Navy officer was who just talked down 4 enemy fighters without firing a shot. "Because 3 months ago I was flying one of them," she said simply. "And because the Navy doesn't leave its people behind, even when they're on medical leave." Peterson was staring at his navigation instruments. "Ma'am, we're back on course for Narita. Fuel consumption is nominal. We'll land with plenty of reserves." "Good." Ghost stood up, feeling suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind the familiar weight of decisions made under pressure, of lives held in balance, of the responsibility that came with wearing wings. "Captain, you might want to make an announcement to the passengers. Tell them the turbulence is over." Martinez nodded. "What should we tell them about you?" Ghost paused at the cockpit door, thinking about the 300 people in the cabin behind her, most of whom would never know how close they'd come to becoming pawns in someone else's war. They'd go home to their families, their jobs, their normal lives, never knowing that, for 20 minutes at 38,000 feet, their safety had depended on the decisions of a pilot who'd been trying to run away from exactly this kind of responsibility. "Tell them a Navy pilot was just doing her job," she said. But as Ghost made her way back through the cabin, past passengers who were already returning to their books and movies and conversations, she knew it wasn't that simple. The tremor in her hands, the way her heart still hammered against her ribs, the cold sweat that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning. These were the symptoms of someone who'd been running from something for 3 months and had just been forced to confront it head-on. She slumped into her seat in 23A, closing her eyes and trying to find that peaceful oblivion she'd been enjoying before the world intruded. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself remembering another flight, 6 months ago, when she'd been the one in the cockpit of an FA-18 Super Hornet, leading a strike package over the South China Sea. That mission had gone wrong in ways that still woke her up screaming some nights. Intelligence failures, communication breakdowns, rules of engagement that changed mid-flight based on political considerations thousands of miles away. She'd brought her people home, all of them, but the cost had been measured in more than fuel and ammunition. It had been measured in the kind of moral injury that no amount of medical leave could heal. The flight attendant appeared at her elbow, the same graying man who'd escorted her to the cockpit. "Ma'am, the captain asked me to give you this." It was a small envelope with her name written on it in Martinez's careful handwriting. Inside was a brief note. "Whatever happened up there, thank you. The crew of United 847 will never forget what you did today." Below that was his signature and those of his co-pilot and flight engineer. Ghost stared at the note for a long time, thinking about the weight of gratitude from people who would never fully understand what they'd been saved from. It was heavier than she'd expected. She looked out the window, where one of the F-22 Raptors was still maintaining escort position. The pilot's helmet was turned toward the airliner, and Ghost found herself wondering what he was thinking. Did he recognize her call sign? Did he know about the incident that had put her on medical leave? Did he understand that she'd just chosen to step back into the world she'd been trying to escape? The Raptor held position for another 10 minutes, then waggled its wings once in the traditional aviator's farewell before peeling away toward whatever base had launched it. Ghost watched until it disappeared, feeling something shift inside her chest, not the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders, but something lighter. Recognition, maybe, or acceptance. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she'd been avoiding for 3 months. Captain Rebecca Torres, her squadron commander, who'd been sending increasingly concerned messages about when Ghost planned to return to active duty. The text message Ghost typed was short. "Rebecca, ready to talk, will call when I land." She hit send before she could change her mind, then settled back in her seat and closed her eyes. This time when sleep came, it came without dreams of falling aircraft or the faces of pilots who hadn't made it home. Instead, she dreamed of clear skies and the feeling of an aircraft responding to her touch, of the moment when training and instinct and pure skill merged into something that could save lives. She dreamed for the first time in months of flying. 2 weeks later, Ghost stood in the briefing room at Naval Air Station Lemoore, wearing a fresh flight suit with creases sharp enough to cut paper. The familiar smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid drifted through the building's ventilation system, and she found herself breathing deeper than she had in months. Coming home, she realized, sometimes meant returning to the place where you'd first learned to be afraid. Captain Torres stood at the front of the room, addressing the assembled pilots of VFA 122, the Flying Eagles. Ghost recognized most of the faces. Some were pilots she'd trained. Others were veterans who'd flown alongside her during her previous deployments. All of them had heard some version of what happened aboard United 847, though the official report had been classified at levels that kept most details out of casual conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Torres announced, "I'm pleased to inform you that Lieutenant Commander Volkov has been cleared for return to active duty, effective immediately. She'll be resuming her position as training officer for advanced tactics, with additional responsibilities for threat assessment and electronic warfare countermeasures." Polite applause filled the room, but Ghost could see the questions in their eyes. She'd been gone for 3 months after what the official records described only as operational stress reaction following combat exposure. In a community where admitting to mental health struggles could end careers, her return carried weight beyond simple personnel reassignment. Lieutenant Jake "Cowboy" Morrison, one of her former students, raised his hand. "Ma'am, will you be resuming flight status immediately?" "That depends," Ghost replied, "on whether you think you can keep up." The laughter that followed was genuine, and Ghost felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. These were her people, pilots who understood that coming back from the edge required more than medical clearance and administrative processing. It required trust in yourself and in the people flying alongside you. After the briefing, Torres pulled Ghost aside for a private conversation in her office. The captain's workspace was exactly what Ghost remembered: precise, efficient, decorated with photos of aircraft and citations for meritorious service, but also humanized by a small collection of houseplants that somehow managed to thrive despite the irregular schedule of military life. "How are you really doing, Kira?" Tors asked, using Ghost's given name in a way that signaled this conversation was happening between friends, not just superior and subordinate. "Better than I was 3 months ago," Ghost replied honestly. "That situation over the Pacific. It reminded me why I do this job. Not for the adrenaline or the recognition, but for the people who depend on us to make the right decisions when everything goes wrong." Tors nodded thoughtfully. "The intelligence community is very interested in your encounter with those J-20s. The technical analysis of their capabilities, their tactics, their apparent training against American systems, it's providing insights we haven't had before." "They weren't Chinese military," Ghost said with certainty. "The formation discipline was too good, but the strategic thinking was wrong. Chinese pilots would never risk that kind of international incident without explicit political authorization. These were contractors or defectors or someone else entirely. That's what concerns the analysts. If there's a private military organization out there with access to advanced stealth fighters and the willingness to threaten civilian aircraft," Tors shrugged. "Well, that's above our pay grade. But your performance in that situation, talking them down without violence, coordinating with the Raptors, getting everyone home safely, that's exactly the kind of thinking we need in our training programs." Ghost looked out the window at the flight line, where ground crews were preparing FA-18 Super Hornets for afternoon training flights. The sight that had once filled her with dread now stirred something she'd almost forgotten: anticipation. Not the adrenaline-fueled excitement of her younger days, but the deeper satisfaction of knowing she had skills that could make a difference when it mattered most. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "I want to talk to the new pilots about what happened out there. Not the classified parts, but the human parts. The decision-making under pressure, the importance of understanding that every action has consequences beyond just the tactical situation." Tors smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. We've got a group of nuggets fresh out of flight school who could use some perspective on what it really means to be a naval aviator in today's world." That afternoon, Ghost found herself standing in front of 12 newly minted pilots, their gold wings still shiny with newness, their flight suits still wrinkled from recent delivery. They looked impossibly young to her, though she realized with some surprise that the oldest among them was probably no more than 5 years younger than she was. "Who can tell me," she began, "what the most important quality in a combat pilot is?" Hands shot up immediately: situational awareness, reaction time, weapons accuracy. Ghost nodded at each answer. "All good, all important, but you're all wrong." She moved to the whiteboard and wrote a single word: judgment. Situational awareness doesn't matter if you can't interpret what you're seeing. Reaction time is worthless if you're reacting to the wrong stimulus. Weapons accuracy means nothing if you're shooting at the wrong target. She turned back to face them. Judgment is the ability to make the right decision with incomplete information under extreme pressure, knowing that people's lives depend on what you choose to do next. One of the pilots, a earnest-looking young man whose name tape-read Chen, raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you develop that kind of judgment?" Ghost considered the question carefully. "By understanding that being right isn't about following the book or impressing your instructors or proving how tough you are. It's about accepting that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is find a way to solve the problem without fighting." She spent the next hour walking them through tactical scenarios, but not the usual air-to-air engagement problems they'd studied in flight school. Instead, she presented them with moral complexities: civilian aircraft in hostile airspace, rules of engagement that conflicted with tactical reality, situations where the correct military response might create larger problems. "2 weeks ago," she said as the session wound down, I was on a commercial flight when 4 hostile aircraft attempted to force us into North Korean airspace. I could have recommended that the captain contact military authorities and request immediate rescue. Instead, I talked to the enemy pilots directly, found out what they were really after, and convinced them that their mission would fail regardless of what they did to our aircraft. The young pilots hung on every word, and Ghost realized they weren't just learning tactics. They were learning what it meant to carry the responsibility that came with the uniform. The point, she continued, is that your primary mission as a naval aviator isn't to shoot down enemy aircraft or deliver ordnance on target or demonstrate American military superiority. Your primary mission is to use your training, your aircraft, and your judgment to protect people and serve the larger interests of national security. Sometimes that means fighting. Sometimes it means talking. Sometimes it means knowing when to walk away.